all. Thanks for joining us. We have got Baljeet, who is from our partner from in US. He is a CPA and partner there. Divya will also join in some time. She is also a partner and she is an expert in immigration law. I welcome you all on behalf of both of our firms, Chug LLPs and Tax Mantra, both in India and in US. Today, we are in a very different situation as we speak. It's an unprecedented challenge which we are facing. It's a global challenge, and the world will change not only in terms of how we travel, in terms of how we live our life, but also in terms of how we do our business. And in that scenario, we thought that we will arrange a webinar where we will focus and deep dig into what's happening in India and US in terms of business scenario and what will change. So to sum up, this webinar will cover from a US perspective. It will cover the basics of setting up in US, tax and legal compliance requirement, and in state laws in general. Baljeet would take care of those aspects. Then the US government has been very proactive in announcing a lot of relief measures, fiscal and relief measures for businesses in US. It's called CARES Act. And so Baljit will also share important updates which are there, which are existing government loan programs and new established programs. So he will share and he will also enlighten us in terms of what's happening in US on that part. And then Divya will help us to understand the immigration law for businesses and entrepreneurs, which used to stand and which was there prior to COVID-19, and what will change post COVID-19. So we will. I also have Rahul with me. He's from our India office. He's a partner in India office, and I and Rahul will talk about the India outlook, what has changed in India, and the basics about setting up in India. A lot of interest which is there in terms of businesses and manufacturing units who wants to set up in India. So we will discuss those points also. So to start with, I welcome Baljeet again, and I request him to start his presentation on the US taxation setting up and also the financial help which the US government is doing to the businesses. Over to Baljeet.
Thank you, Locke. So it's about
And
8:34, in the morning here in New Jersey, US. Good morning, everyone who are attending from the US, and good evening to all from India. I welcome you all to this webinar. I hope everyone is keeping safe under these difficult times. I wish all of you and your families excellent health. In the aftermath of the effects of COVID-19, the US has enacted several acts. Now, the objective is to help people and businesses that bear the downside that is caused by this pandemic. Now, the most important one is the True Trillion CARES Act, that is Coronavirus Aid Relief and Economic Security Act. Now, our firm has done quite a few webinars on the True Trillion Act and leveraging funding, and there has been an overwhelming response. We will spend some time going over the details on it. Before that, a little on overall outlook as far as US and India are concerned. Now, it's not that we have not navigated crises and disruptions in the past, but never in our lifetime have we experienced such an abrupt change to our daily lives as we have in recent times. Now, what we are witnessing is that business owners are being pushed into the world's most massive virtual social experiment, where millions of people must learn online, share their knowledge online, and work together online. Now, what all of this makes us think and start doing is that use technology to move forward. Now, talking about the US, and it will be right for India as well, many businesses are using online tools and platforms to stay connected with their customers and continue to profit during these unprecedented times. Now, some example that we have seen right in our homes are teacher for our kids, yoga and meditation studios, our doctors, and all of us who are conducting and attending this webinar. Now, most companies have been forced to work remotely. Now, some of more prominent companies have learned to make it work, and even it is turning out to be beneficial to have more people work remotely. Now, it would result in saving on real estate cost and other overheads. Now, at the same time, companies are able to attract and retain talent that might otherwise not have been able to work from companies' physical offices. Now, US India Business Council recently said that India is expected to benefit, as it is likely that businesses will want to de-risk in having too much of a supply chain concentrated in one area and try to diversify and disperse. Now, all of us would agree, and we have already seen some of it happening, like Japan government is spending billions of dollars to help move Japanese companies outside of China to India. Now, after the COVID-19 pandemic, India will have the opportunity to build an economy that is more resilient, diversified, and attractive to global manufacturers and services. Now, since we are doing this webinar primarily for Indian businesses, we thought it would make sense if we briefly talk about how setting up tax and legal compliances work in general in the United States. Now, there are a lot of consideration when we think of setting up a business in the US. Now, what type of company should we choose? Where precisely in the US should we set up? When people search online, there is a lot of talk about Delaware. So should we incorporate in the state of Delaware and various other consideration? Now, let's start with the first one, which is type of company. Now, when we think of setting up in the US, now the most common incorporation choices that we have is corporation and limited liability company. Now, there are other structures which are available, but now I'll repeat that it's a two most common for businesses in general. Now, both of these forms have limited liability. Now, shareholders own corporation through their shares of stock. When company is formed, the corporation basically is telling the state government that how many shares of stock it is going to be issuing to the stockholders. Now, LLC, on the other hand, are owned by members. Now, since LLC are based on partnership law, the owners are listed in the operating agreement that runs the company. So corporation is a more formal structure. Now, you can have LLC when you are looking for a highly flexible management structure, or it is good for holding real estate. Now, if you're looking for more formal structure, you should go for a corporation when you want to attract investor, you want to scale up and offer certain tax benefits to employee in the longer run and go public in the future. Now, moving on to the tax choices. When you incorporate any business as a corporation, then if you don't do anything, so C corporation is the default tax structure you get. And you can make an election to be taxed as a S corporation as well. When you form your business as a LLC, and if you don't do anything, if it's a one member LLC, it is taxed as a sole proprietor. And if there are two or more members, then it is by default taxed as a partnership. However, at the same time, you can make election for these to be taxed as a C corporation and S corporation. Now, what does these above tax choices mean? Now, when we talk about C corporation, what it means is that all the income of the business is going to be taxed at a corporate level. And later on, when a business distribute income to the stockholders, then they are going to pay tax on it at an individual level on the dividend income. Now, other structure that I talked about, S corporation, sole proprietor, partnership, or S corporation again. Now, these are the flow through entities. What it means is that all the profit of the business, they flow to the individual owners and they at their individual level pay the taxes on it. Now, the question is, what is more beneficial? Now, the answer is very simple. It depends. Individual taxes are based on different tax brackets, and the corporate federal tax rate currently is 21% in the US. Now, if an individual withdraws money from the corporation, they pay taxes on it as a dividend income. Now, the choice between C corporation and one of the other pass-through entity really depends on whether the business would like to keep money in the business for expansion or would like to distribute. And second factor is that individual income level and tax bracket. Now, simple example of it. If there is a C corporation and business earn income, let's say $100,000, and they pay taxes at a corporate level 21%. Now, if they do not distribute, they just get away with paying 21% and use the remaining 79,000 to expand. Now, comparing it to if it was a pass-through entity and all the income passed through to the owners on their individual tax return. Now, if they are already in 37% tax bracket and they have additional income, then they end up paying 37% taxes on it. So it is essential that a careful analysis is done, keeping in mind business and business owners' overall objective. And also please note that S corporation, which is the most preferred structure among small businesses in the United States, it's not available for non-resident stockholders. Now, moving on, the next question comes is that where to set up and incorporate your business. Now, whenever we think of setting up a business in US,
So Baljeet, just one thing. So what you're saying is that if you want to raise capital, if you are a typical startup, then for you, C Corp is the only option. But then because then you will able to give ESOPs, you will able to give stock to your investors, you will able to create a subsidiary parent relationship. I think that's what you're trying to suggest.
exactly. So, for any small businesses who are kind of confined to, one single state, and they have no expansion plan, and especially, our retailers client. Now, for them, it makes sense. Maybe they can do LLC and then, just limited to one state. But then for businesses, who are looking for expansions and whose plan is to go global and even within the US, to expand to the various state. So it makes sense for them to have a more formal structure. And in simple words, if you really were to compare in context of India, the private limited company is a perfect example of what a C corporation looks like.
Yeah. And how difficult it is to convert a LLC or a sole proprietorship into C Corp?
So it really depends on which state it is. There are states who are pretty flexible, and that is one of the reason that at the time when set up and the business are not certain that where exactly they want to incorporate their business, they would look for some of these flexible state where they are later able to convert LLC to a C corporation. Delaware is one of those states, and we're going to talk a little more about Delaware in the next slide.
Okay, perfect.
All right. So now moving on, the next question, as I was saying, is where to set up, and incorporate. And whenever when we are outside of US and we think of incorporating a business, we think that we are actually setting up business in the US. So which is kind of true, but in reality, you are setting up your business in one of the states in the US. In US, 50 states are like different 50 countries. And if you set up a business in one state and then you do business in another state, you need to get additional certificate of authority from that other state. So uh, first thing people have to think in their mind is that from a business perspective, where does it make sense for them? Is it a good market for them to start or expand their operations? Are they having low setup and operational cost? When I talk about operational cost, there are certain states where once you incorporate the business, you end up paying minimum taxes. And at the same time, there are states you incorporate, and unless you actually do business, you do not incur any cost. So that's one of the important consideration that businesses need to keep in mind. Now, many a time, we see a question that do we incorporate in a state where doing business or in a different state? Now, it actually really depends, on the business long-term expansion plan. Like I was saying earlier, if you are going to be confined to one single state, and then you don't have any specific expansion plans, then maybe think of incorporating in the same state where you are going to have the business operation. But at the same time, if you have plans to expand all over, then maybe you should look for a state which is more flexible like Delaware, and then later on you keep having the additional certificate of authority from other state to do your business. Now, often a time, whenever we help businesses to set up their business in the US, they read on the internet that why don't we incorporate in Delaware? And there is a lot about Delaware. So let us quickly discuss that. If you want to incorporate in Delaware, why you should really incorporate there. Now, first of all, if there is a new business and looks to attract outside investment from angels, venture capitalists, and private equity, incorporating in Delaware is often the best choice. Many investors, only invest in Delaware C corporations. Delaware laws regarding securities and management fit in with the expectation of professional investors. Now, even if you launch your startup as an LLC in Delaware, you can easily convert LLC to a C corporation with one single state filing and one IRS filing. Now, other reason to incorporate in the state of Delaware is the business legal system. Now, Delaware has special business code, and the judges have extensive knowledge of those laws, so which makes it easy for businesses to navigate should any dispute arises. Delaware offers a lot of tax saving. There is no state income tax or filing requirement unless you actually do business in the state. There are no inheritance tax on the stock if a non-resident holds in the state of Delaware. There are no state sales taxes on intangible personal property. Now, Delaware is often a good choice when many states are required to file annual returns, even if no business is done in those states. Now, especially when the states are uncertain as to where they are going to be establishing operations in the longer run, the often the Delaware is the good choice. Now, having considered all these benefit, we just need to bear in mind that Delaware requires filing an annual report and pay taxes based on the authorized capital of the business. Now, this is an important consideration. At the time, when we set up any business in the state of Delaware, the capital should be structured in such a way that minimum taxes are paid. Now, it is not an income tax. It is like comparing, ROC filings in India. It's an annual report, and it's called franchise tax, and the tax is based on the authorized capital and issued stock and the assets of the business. Now, another important point is that if business is registered in the state of Delaware and business is done in another state, it's kind of, I'm reiterating it, then the company needs to obtain an additional certificate of authority from the other state and do the necessary compliance in that other state as well. Now, if all of these benefits which are there for the Delaware state are making sense, and businesses are not going to be in one state, then they can think of incorporating in Delaware state. Else, if they are going to be confined to one state, then they should incorporate in that one state only. Now, moving on to some of the other considerations, when businesses come to US for setting up. One important aspect is the bank account. Now, when there is a residence owner of the company in US, it's very easy. They go to the bank, and then with the certificate of incorporation and federal ID of the business, and they are able to set up the bank account. However, it becomes a little challenging when there are non-resident owners which are involved. Now, they usually have to be present here in person to set up a bank account. Now, the workaround is that they authorize somebody in the US who represent the company as an authorized signatory and officer, and they are able to, with the social security number, and then they are able to set up a bank account even without being present in the US. The other important aspect is the transfer pricing. Now, it's very obvious when there is a business in a foreign country and then they set up in the US, there are going to be transactions between affiliates. Now, since there are going to be transactions, now people need to be aware that there are transfer pricing regulations that they need to be aware about. Now, the basic rule of thumb is that the transaction should be done at an arm's length, as if those two parties are unrelated, and the US company should be maintaining reasonable margins. Now, the transfer pricing regulation do exist in the US. However, there is no mandatory study or filing required at the time of filing the tax returns. Now, the tax authority always has the right to challenge the position that we have taken or prices that we have used. Now, for the startup companies who come to the United States, getting a transfer pricing study done in the US is an expensive affair. It would cost anywhere from $15,000 to $35,000 to get a transfer pricing study done. Now, as per my understanding, India also has some sort of a reporting requirement. Now, as a practical measure, what business do is they get a study done from an India perspective, or they maintain the standard, margins. That is in no way, is a shortcut to not having the study done. But then, it's a less likely if they are maintaining the reasonable margin, their files are going to be selected by the tax authority for audit purposes. The other important, question that we are asked is whether the businesses who set up in US are able to repatriate their profits, to their home country. Now, the answer is, that's yes, they are able to repatriate. It's quite straightforward. They can do. However, there is a requirement of 30% withholding of taxes of any dividend distributions by a US company to the foreign stockholder. Now, US has tax treaty with various countries, and as per those tax treaty, there are usually a reduced rate of withholding. And as per the US and India tax treaty, if the stockholder of a US company is a corporation, then there is a 50% withholding. And for an individual stockholder, it's 25% tax withholding. So at the time of structuring, this is an important consideration that businesses should have in mind. If the way they can structure is they can have a US company and then the corporate owner of that US company, so that when they repatriate profits in the form of a dividend, they end up paying less withholding taxes. Businesses coming to US, they should make sure that they protect their IP. That includes, all their trademarks, logos, patent, trade secret, or any other sort of IP. Many businesses, need special license or permits in order to do business in the US. That will be example, like a professional services that we have, or any specialized products, that we are dealing in, or any restricted services like, military goods. So once you know that which state or state you will operate your business in, you can check, with that state government to find out what license or permits, may be required for your company's activities. And last, but not the least, when you are setting up, is the immigration requirement. So, we often see that, business at the time of setting up don't consider all these immigration requirements, and then see that, if then later on they want to send their senior people or employees in the US, how exactly to navigate, and often they end up doing a lot of restructuring. So Dia Matthews later, is going to talk in details about how the immigration works in general. Now,
Baljeet,
moving on.
so Baljeet, we
Yes.
have got a couple of queries. Do you mind taking it up this time?
Yeah, sure, please.
So Nitya has got a query. I will just enable Nitya. Just a second. So Nitya, I have enabled your voice. You can speak now.
Yeah, hi Baljeet. This
Hello,
has been
hello, Nitya.
interesting so far. So yeah, now I just had this question about the bank account. Like I'm saying, I actually work in a company where my CEO, she has the SSN number. She is based out of India, but can we still open a bank account in the US? And she
Yes,
is.
see, often for the bank account, the banks are going to request, physical presence here. They are going to see the authorized signatory of the business. Then only they are going to open the bank account. There could be, some workaround, which, maybe I'm not aware of. But then in general, the banks have been strict. And also adding to that, not all the banks actually, willing to open the bank account for a company which has non-resident stockholders. So, with our experience, most of the time our clients, who are a non-resident setting up business in the US, they end up visiting here and then open the bank account.
Okay, and then can I just go? I have one more on the transfer pricing. You said you said we had to do that study. Basically, is it going to be too different from the Indian laws and the US laws? Is there something? Is it
Okay,
distinctly
so
different?
if we so I have seen the transfer pricing study reports for both the countries, and if we really dig into it, the basic methods, the way they conduct the transfer pricing study are very, very similar. However, and then, many times as a practical measure, let's say that, the tax authority here in US challenges, and you produce the study that is done in India, maybe they will accept it, maybe they will not. But then, like I said, that, you are on a safer side if you are maintaining reasonable margins, and it's very unlikely that they are going to pick your file for audit. IRS has limited time and resources, to kind of, select files for audit. So, if like, let's say, the standard margin in the IT industry is 8 to 10%, 15%, and then the business is ridiculously, showing the losses for year after year, then, that are the cases which are going to be selected for audit. However, if, the business are showing a reasonable margin, with my experience, I have hardly seen, files picked up for audit, from a transfer pricing study standpoint.
So Baljeet, just a follow-up
Thank you, sir.
question.
Mhm.
Thanks, Nitya. So just a follow-up question. In US, is there a threshold limit for transfer pricing documentation?
Not really. So there is no limit, for the documentation. Just that, like I said, at the time, when you file the tax returns, you don't submit any documents. It's only later when they challenge, and then when they see that, year after year, businesses are not showing the income. That is a time when they're going to kind of come after the business and then, raise all these questions.
Okay, cool. Just one more. So I'm just enabling Samyak Jain. I hope I'm able to pronounce his name correctly. Samyak, I have just enabled your voice.
Yeah, hi, Alok.
Hi.
So just wanted to check with Baljeet one that in case a US company is sending some money to an Indian company on account of a professional or technical fees, is there some sort of withholding which has to be done in the US?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, when US company, is kind of making payments for the professional services, then there is no withholding requirement. The requirement is that, the Indian company certifies on a form, IRS form, W8 Ben form, that all the services are being provided outside of US. And because of that, there is not going to be any withholding. They are not subject to the tax filings.
But exactly what if the person is providing services to that particular US company only?
Sorry, say that again.
So suppose there's an IT company in the US and we have an Indian company who's providing those some services to that US company.
Okay.
So, and the US company makes the payment on account of those services.
Right.
So, does withholding come here?
So Baljeet and I'll like to pitch in here. So what I understand, Baljeet, I'll want to know your views also on this. This is a very common question in India. So in India, what happens that any income which is originating from India is usually deemed to accrue or arise in India and is chargeable to tax in India. So there are withholding taxes. So even if there is a US person or a US company providing services from US, and if an Indian company or Indian person is making the payment, they are liable to withhold tax because India taxes the income of any person whose income is either accruing or arising in India, or it is deemed to accrue or arise in India. But what I understand is that in the US, it's if the income is actually originating in the US, if I am a company who is going to US and providing services to the US company, then only I get covered under the tax laws of the US. If I'm sitting in India and providing services to the US, then usually, as you said, by filling up a form, we are not required to undergo deduction, and the US company will not do the tax deduction.
Right. Yeah. So your question is actually the other way around, right? So, I will not be able to say how it works in India, but then even, our firm is also in that situation. We have clients in India, and then, we have seen even, the big fours also representing them, and, they will come to us and then say that, we will withhold taxes on the fee that we are paying to your firm. And then when we produce a tax residency certificate to them, which we get from a tax authority here, then they don't withhold the taxes. So technically, if the services are not being rendered in India, they should not be withholding. That's what my understanding is.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. We have been bombarded with a lot of queries, but I think we have dedicated Q&A at the end of the session. So I think we can move ahead, Baljeet, and then as and when I think that there is a specific query, I will disturb you in between.
Okay, sure. So let's move on, to the compliances. The compliances that are needed in general in the US. If we can move to the next slide, please. So, primarily businesses have to file federal income taxes and the state income taxes in the US. Now, federal income tax, all the companies have to file here in the US. Now, talking about the state, it really depends on, few factors. One of the important one is, like the nexus. So basically, when we talk about nexus, businesses need to file state filings, if they establish some sort of a nexus. Now, the nexus can be physical nexus, which means that if business have employee in the US, they have property, they have rent revenue in a specific state. Now, the physical nexus used to be historically prevalent all over. Now, in the recent years, economic nexus concept has picked up a lot, meaning that even if the businesses are not physically in existence and they are deriving some sort of economic benefit out of the state, then they need to comply with that state. Now, having said that, there is a concept of threshold. For example, there is a non-New York company and then generating some revenue out of New York. They are based somewhere else, in the United States, in some other state. Now, up to $1 million, if they derive revenue, then they don't have to file in the New York state. So basically, it varies from state to state whether the business is established nexus or no. And when they are, what we advise to our clients is that when they are indulging into any sort of transaction with any state, then they should get that nexus analysis study done and then make sure that if they are subject to compliance, they do the compliance. Now, earlier I mentioned that business need to file federal and state income tax, so they are on an annual basis. In addition to that, businesses need to file annual reports, which are with the Secretary of State. So how it is different from India is, like in India, we have ROC reports. Now in US, since all the states are like different countries, now if business is doing business, any sort of activity in state and they have got a certificate of authority, then they need to file annual reports with all those states. Now we have clients who are operating in 40 states and then they are doing compliance in all those 40 states. Now, having said that, there are some states, which will not require the annual report filing for many years, like for example, Pennsylvania is one exception where annual report is not required for 10 years. Now, talking about the income tax payments, businesses in US need to pay as they earn the income. It's very similar to, like in India, we pay advanced taxes on a quarterly basis. So businesses also here in the US, they need to pay taxes on a quarterly basis on their income that they earn. Now, I will briefly touch upon how the sales tax work in the US. So sales tax is a destination-based tax. Basically, the state where the people are deriving benefits, that's a state where the taxes need to be paid. Now, in US, generally the products are subject to sales taxes, services are not. However, there are certain states where services are also subject to taxes. Historically, even the sales tax was also being taxed based on a physical location of the business. However, in recent time, in 2018, there was a Supreme Court judgment where the big company Wayfair had litigation with the state of South Dakota, where Supreme Court ruled that even if there is no physical existence, states have the authority to enforce the applicability of sales tax. Now, after that, a lot of states have new legislations, and they are bringing more and more businesses into their purview of sales tax. Now, businesses never expected that, and that's a heads up that usually I like to give to my clients. So, for example, the state of Connecticut has 1% sales tax on the software services, and many a time we see that businesses being audited and they end up paying large penalties, due to non-compliance of sales tax. So, in this dynamic, times of the sales tax, basically business need to make sure that they get evaluated whether they are subjected to sales tax or no, based on the product or services they are offering. Now, moving on to one of the most important area that we wanted to talk about today is the financial assistance under the CARES Act. So, under the CARES Act, there are various tax benefits, that are being offered by the government, and that are, tax filing extensions, tax credit, deferring of the payment, among others. So, time permitting, I'll talk about some of those benefits. However, the programs, that got the most attention are the loan program that the government is giving for different sizes of businesses, that you see on your screen. So we'll move on to the first program in detail out of this 5. So if we can move on to the next slide. So payroll protection program, is the first program. So the funds allocated to the PPP loans are 349 billion. They were allocated initially. Now, what happened was that this program came on April 3, and it was all exhausted by April 13. Now, the government additionally allocated 310 billions more. Now, the basic requirement under this program is that businesses must retain 90% of employment levels as of March 24. Now, it's a SBA-backed program. SBA is a Small Business Administration. It's an authority in the US. So that loan is being provided by the bank, but backed by the SBA. Now, all businesses, that includes even non-profit under 501c3, sole proprietorship, self-employed individuals, and independent contractor who have 500 or less employee, they qualify for this program. Now, the requirement is those small businesses and entities must have been in operation on February 15. Maximum term under this loan is 2 years, and interest rate is 1%. Businesses don't have to pay this loan immediately. They are able to defer for 6 months minimum and maximum up to a year. The way this loan amount is being calculated is 2.5 times of average monthly payroll of the business over a period of 12 months. For the seasonal businesses, there are different requirements. The maximum loan size is $10 million. Now, it's important that since this loan amount is based on payroll, so we need to see what exactly the payroll cost include. So it is not only a gross payroll, but then there are certain other expenses that are added for this. So all the vacation, family, medical, or sick leave payments, any health insurance that business is paying for the employees, any retirement payment that are being paid, or any state or local taxes that business is paying on employees' compensation. Moving on. So this loan is to be utilized for certain expenses, which include payroll cost of the businesses, rent, utility, or group healthcare benefit that are being offered to the employees, any mortgage obligations. So the good part, about this loan is that there is no collateral required from either the business or its owners. And even the shocking part, best part is that this loan doesn't need to be returned, provided it is used for certain purpose, meaning it is used for payroll cost, utility payments, any rent payments, or any specific covered mortgage obligation. So obviously the banks are going to verify the documentation to make sure that the loan is used for the purposes it was intended. Now let's move to the next category of financial assistance that is available, which is
Baljit, I have one query. So in this,
Yes.
the first criteria, does the payroll also include payroll for directors?
Yes. See, so basically, the way they are calculating the payroll is the loan amount is that they are taking average of the last 12 months and then multiplying that by 2.5 times. So basically, businesses are being supported to pay payroll cost to the employees for the next 2 months. And the idea is that the employment levels are retained. So this is what US is doing to make sure that the business don't fire the employees and retain them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And Baljit, does it also include external employees? So employees who are not based out of United States, payroll of the company, but working elsewhere?
No, so it includes only the US employees. When the businesses are going to actually file the documentation, they are going to make sure they see the payroll reports which are from the US, and the US taxes have been paid on that.
Sure. And one more question, Baljit. Do they have any restriction for companies who have foreign owners? If Indians have incorporated, does it apply to everyone, or is there any restriction on basis of the ownership or presence in the US?
That's a very good question, and then that applies to almost all of our clients. The clients who are in India, a lot of big companies, and then they are present here. So like I said, that the PPP loan is for employers who have less than 500 employees. And since these loans are backed by SBA, Small Business Administration, now initially, and the definition of small business as per SBA is that they count the employees of all the companies, all affiliated companies together. But later on, since the idea was to support the US businesses, and then they are present in the US, and then to make sure that employees in the US are retained, SBA came up with the clarification that for the purposes of these loan, the foreign affiliates will not be counted. Employees of the foreign affiliates will not be counted. So, which means that the US companies who have foreign stockholders, Indian stockholders, they are also getting this PPP loan and able to get this forgiven.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay. So, do we move on to the next one?
Sure.
All right. So now the next assistance we have is EADL. So initially, US government had allocated $17 billion, and then now additional 50 billion, added to this loan. Now, all the small businesses, that includes the sole proprietors, even with or without employees, any independent contractor, and certain private nonprofits, and who have been in operation since the end of January. The requirement is that they should have less than 500 employees. Now, this loan is being given by Small Business Administration directly. There is no SBA fee, and this loan term is 30 years at a very good rate. 3.75% is being offered, and 2.75% for nonprofits. Businesses don't have to pay this loan immediately. They can start paying after 1 year, or even they are able to defer the interest and loan payment for up to 4 years. Now, what happened? A lot of businesses were able to get an emergency grant. So as part of this program, businesses were able to apply for $10,000 emergency advance, and then within few days they were able to get that $10,000 while their application was pending. A lot of businesses got advantage of that, and loans up to 2 million one business can get. Now currently, it's in the second round. When the first funds in the first round were exhausted, currently the applications are not being accepted for the second round. Moving on, this loan is primarily for working capital. So it can be used to pay the fixed debt, any payroll and sick leave of the employees, any accounts payable, or other bills that businesses are not able to pay due to COVID-19. Now, it is important to mention that the loan cannot be used to refinance debts that were incurred prior to COVID-19, or to make payments on any loan which were given by another federal agency or SBA, or any tax penalties of some sort. Now, many business owners asked us that, should they apply for EADL or they should apply for the PPP loan. Now, EADL loan is good choice for business who are really in need of cash in the near future. They get immediate access to $10,000. Hopefully, they open this loan again, and businesses who have operational costs that they would like to utilize for. On the other hand, this PPP loan is almost for all businesses, that have had a payroll. They kind of, getting free money if they maintain their employment levels and get the loan forgiven when the loans are used as required in the program. Now, we move on to the program which are for some sort of a bigger businesses. One is a Main Street Lending Program. Now, the total fund that are allocated to this program are $600 billion, and small and medium-sized businesses who have less than 10,000 employees or less than 2.5 billion in 2019 revenue, are eligible for this loan. Now, recently the change happened towards the end of the last week, that now the limit of this 10,000 employees have been increased to 15,000, and the revenue has been increased from 2.5 billion to $5 billion. Now, this change is also announced, to expand the type of loan that will be given under this program. The loan is being given 4 times of EBITDA of the business, adjusted by any current used or unused loan, and the maximum loan is $25 million. It's at a very good rate of 2.5% to 4% for a period of 4 years. However, there are certain restrictions, and they want to make sure that the purpose of the loan is to maintain employment level and it's not misappropriated in any way. So the basic requirement is the businesses should retain 90% of workforce. Executive compensation restrictions are there in terms of monetary dollar value, and businesses cannot repurchase a stock or declare any dividend. And one of the most important requirement is that recipient will not outsource or offshore jobs for the term of the loan and 2 years after completing repayment of the loan. Now, this loan is open up to 30th September. And even if a business has already applied for the PPP loan that we discussed earlier, they will still be eligible for this loan. So it's not a loan that's going to be forgiven, but it's a loan which is at a very favorable rate and definitely going to stimulate the businesses, big businesses. Again, I reiterate the basic requirement is that at least 90% of the workforce at full compensation and benefits should be maintained by the business till September 30, 2020. Now, moving on.
One question, Baljit.
Yes.
So in this restriction includes that there is no outsourcing allowed. It means Indian companies who have sales offices or have head offices in US and they outsource it to their Indian subs or associated companies, mainly those companies will not be able to take the benefit of this loan, and only the companies who have their workforce in US will be able to benefit from this.
Exactly. See, the idea is that, so what has been happening, we saw the unemployment levels, that went up like anything in the US. Now, all of these loan programs, this assistance program that the US government has is to make sure that, the people are able to retain their employment levels. Now, in all these programs, one thing consistently that I have seen is that businesses are required to maintain 90% of the workforce in the US. So yes, you are right. The outsourcing of the job should not happen, and it should be able to retain the employees in the US, then the business qualify. Yes.
Sure. Thanks.
Now, moving on. So, there is no requirement, Rahul, like you asked earlier about affiliate of the foreign entity. So there is no requirement for the employees of affiliate under the common control to be considered in calculating the number of employees, for these loans. And the requirement is, any applicant who is applying for this loan should be organized under the laws of the US. And accordingly, a US subsidiary of a foreign entity is permitted to participate if they otherwise qualify. So important change, like I mentioned in the beginning, that the federal is also offering different set of loans, under this category, and the changes break the loans into 3 different categories: new, priority, and expanded. So new and priority loans have a minimum size of 500,000, and expanded loans are 10 millions and up. So basically, within the same program, they have recently changed and then break it into 3 categories. Now, moving on. The next category of loan that we have is financial assistance under the Coronavirus Economic Stabilization Act, called CISA. So the total fund that have been allocated for the loan purposes under this program are $450 billion. Now, this applies to all the mid-sized businesses with 500 to 10,000 employees. And there is no specific amount or calculation has been provided yet as to the amount of the loan, because this program is still going to be open. See, US initially took care of all the small businesses with less than 500 employees. And for the bigger businesses, they have announced this program, but they are going to be open in the near future. On this loan, interest is 2% and loan duration of 5 years. There are some restrictions on the use of funds, like in the other programs. So businesses cannot buy back their listed stock or listed stock of their parent companies. They cannot use these funds for any dividend distributions. They cannot use these funds to unreasonably pay compensation of their executives, or they cannot use these funds to pay any other debts. So under these programs, the borrower have to attest that they will not seek to cancel or reduce any of their outstanding line of credits. Now, this loan program is going to be open through the end of this year. And if business get a PPP loan that we discussed earlier, they will not qualify for loan under this category. Again, like I said, businesses have a requirement to maintain the employment levels, for these loans. Now, the last one on the list, for the financial assistance is the EXIM assistance, that we have. The Export-Import Bank of the United States, has also come to the aid of all the financial institutions and exporters, in the US that have been impacted by this COVID-19 by announcing several relief provisions. To the relief measures, include extension of deadlines, waivers, streamlined processing, and flexibility. The special program, that EXIM introduced are Working Capital Guarantee Program, multi-buyer and single-buyer short-term insurance program, and medium-term single-buyer insurance policies. So the customers, of EXIM are encouraged, to be in touch with them and see that what could be the beneficial to them. Now, moving on to some of the other tax benefit that came as part of the CARES Act, and I'll quickly go over the list in the interest of time.
One question, Baljit.
Yes.
So for this benefits, as we discussed, like there are different limits. In the first one, we saw that at least 500 employees should be there. Then
Yes.
we saw the restriction of 90% of the employees being retained. So for checking these cutoffs, do we have a specific date as on which it has to be seen? So if some company has 400 employees, and so during this month, if it hires 100 more employees, is it eligible for this? Like, are there any cutoff dates for seeing these criteria?
See, all these programs have cutoff dates, like, the two programs that I mentioned at the beginning. So March 24 specifically said, so basically, they are going to see that what were the employment levels before this COVID-19 happened. And in context of that, whether the businesses are maintaining at least 90% of the employment levels. So, they are going to go by the number of employees, and usually the payroll reports here that are filed with the tax authorities have the number of employees on it. So that they are going to be the reference point. And then later on, when the loan is applied, they are going to refer to those reports.
Got it.
Now, let's move on to, and I'll be really quick on all these other benefits that happened under the CARES Act. So one is the tax filing and payment dates have been extended. So earlier, the date of filing in the US was April 15. That has been extended by July 15. Not only the date of filing has been extended, but the date of payment also has been extended. Now, the businesses who are operating in various states, they should check with the state. Generally, other states have also expanded a date, but then it's always a good idea to check when the business is operating in various states. Now, businesses are supposed to pay, sick leave for the sick leave and family and medical leave, and they are getting tax credit, for making payments. There are certain monetary limits on the amount of credit that they'll get. R&D tax credit usually, help businesses to set off their income tax liability. But then due to this COVID situation, the new provision was added to the R&D tax credit that businesses are able to use it for the payroll tax liability, which is like a more frequent. Businesses are need to pay on a weekly basis, monthly basis, or quarterly basis, depending on the amount that they owe. So that's a great relief from a cash flow standpoint to the businesses. Then there is an employee retention credit for employers who are subjected to closure due to the COVID. Now, when this COVID-19 came suddenly, that impacted lives of millions, then US had enacted Family First Coronavirus Response Act, and that set up a fully refundable tax credit for businesses of all sizes that are closed or distressed to help the key workers on the payroll. So the credit is 50% of the payroll on 10,000 of compensation per quarter, including the health benefit of each employee. The other good relief, that is given to the businesses, delay of payment of employment payroll taxes. So as per this provision, businesses who incur any payroll taxes from March 27 onwards to December 31st, 2020, they are able to defer the payment of taxes. Half of this amount is going to be due on December 31st, 2021, and the other half on December 31st, 2022. Big relief for businesses from a cash standpoint. Another relief is modification for net operating losses. So currently, the rule is that businesses are able to set off up to 80% of their taxable income against the net operating losses, and they cannot carry back the losses, but they can carry forward. Now, the two provisions are actually added for the net operating loss. So one is that net operating loss that arises in the year 2018, 19, or 20 can be carried back. So what it means is that businesses who had profits from 2013 to 2017 and have a loss in 18, 19, or 20, they are able to set off this loss against the income that they had in the prior years and get a refund of taxes that they already paid on the income. So that's a big relief, from a cash standpoint. And the second provision that was changed under the net operating loss is now there is no limitation of setting of a net operating loss up to 80%. That has been extended to 100% of the taxable income can be set off with the net operating loss. Now, modification of limitation on business interest. Currently, the businesses were able to set off up to 30% of the interest expense that they have, on their income statement. Now, given that a lot of businesses are going to avail of this benefits of loans, they are going to incur more interest expenses. So the limit of 30% has been extended to 50% of the taxable income that businesses can deduct under the interest expenses. Now, there is nothing specific happened for the technology companies, except that they are going to benefit like all the other small businesses under this relief program. In fact, there was one negative provision in the act for the technology company that if they are funded by the venture capital partnership, they will not get any financial assistance. Now, hotels are the one that got good benefit, and the reason is they are able to get the funding under these loan programs, but then for the purposes of counting, the small business limit of 500, each hotel is going to be considered separately, even if they belong to the same group. So that's a big relief for the hotels. For the retailers and restaurant, so they were expecting a massive help. We personally witnessed that some of our clients who were operating in New York City and having a restaurant, they had to shut down almost overnight. So they did not get any massive help they were expecting, but they are able to write off all the improvements that they do as part of the expenses. Usually, they do it over a period of 39 years. Now, moving on. So before I conclude, let me share that the reality is that COVID is pushing all of us into the corner. However, we must have heard that when someone pushes you into the corner, you push the corner away. Now, the question is, how do we push the corners away in the context of business during these times? The answer is all of us will figure it out together. And some of the possible ways are finding different ways of working, doing business or providing services, reducing the cost of doing business, finding new opportunities, take benefit from what is being offered by the government, take this opportunity to balance work life that we have always been complaining about. And more than anything, support each other. So in the beginning, I had mentioned that among various essential considerations for businesses to enter and stay in the United States, immigration is probably one of the most important one. Now, I will now hand over to Dia Matthews, who is going to talk about immigration in detail. I will catch up again during the Q&A session or anytime after that. My contact information will be shared. If I do not get a chance to say towards the end, I wish you all an excellent health. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you. Over to you, Dia.
Thanks, Baljit. Hi, everyone. My name is Dia Matthews. As Baljit mentioned, I'm an immigration partner with the New Jersey office of Chugh LLP. We've done quite a few webinars on the topics that Baljit went over, and also about immigration. I guess these are the hot button topics right now for Indian clients. So I'll share briefly about some of the main immigration issues that people have raised in the last couple of months. First, about H-1Bs, of course, because the majority of H-1B visa holders in the US are from India, and then a little bit about the other visa types, impact of the whole COVID situation on green card processing, and finally about about whether the availing of any of the loans that Baljit talked about, whether that has any immigration impact. Okay, so first a quick summary of the whole H-1B cap situation, which is the H-1B lottery process. As many of you might know, this was the very first year that USCIS, which is the immigration agency administering the immigration program, this was the very first year that they changed the system to a registration system, which is that you basically put in a registration application, and only if you're selected in the registrations, then you put in the actual petition or the actual H-1B application. And so the benefit to employers is immense, because they don't spend they don't have to spend on the filing fees or the administrative cost of putting together a petition, unless they know that that they're actually going to get a shot in the lottery, right? So that process was completed in around March, by the 20th of March. They received over 275,000 applications in total. And not surprisingly, about 70% of the applications were from applicants of Indian origin, Indian nationals. And about 50% of them were from people who had completed US master's degree programs in the US. So right now we are in the 90-day window that USCIS has provided for selected registration applicants to file their actual petitions with USCIS. So it remains to be seen how quickly they will adjudicate these petitions, because one of the effects of the whole COVID pandemic was that USCIS had to suspend the ability for premium processing, which is that you pay an additional fee and get expedited adjudication on these cases. So with the current situation, they've had to suspend that program, and it will need to be seen how long they will take to actually adjudicate these petitions. So there's going to be some uncertainty mainly for students in the US, because with many students, what happens is they are coming up on the end of their F1, the student status, and they need the H-1B status to start by October. But with the suspension of premium processing, we don't know whether they'll be able to have their H-1B visas adjudicated by October. So there might be a little bit of a gap, which we'll have to look into. Again, on H-1B for employees, for people who are already in the US in H-1B status, there has been some change in their situation, because projects have been canceled, or the availability of work is not guaranteed. So when it comes to employees and employers, in H-1B status, the thing to keep in mind is that if there is going to be any major change in the terms of the H-1B petition that was filed with USCIS, so for example, if the employer wants to do a pay cut or a furlough, or make you part-time, those are changes that you can effect only after filing an amendment petition with USCIS. So the employer cannot unilaterally just change things around. you have to notify the immigration agency by filing an amendment petition. So that's the main thing to keep in mind in terms of H-1B compliance. Moving on to other visa types, the other issue that we've encountered in recent months is a lot of questions from people who maxed out their stay in the US. So for example, somebody came here on a work assignment and that work assignment has ended, but unfortunately they cannot return to their home country because of travel restrictions in countries like India, right? There's no incoming flights that are allowed. So what do? Well, so, there's really just two options. One, either you extend your stay in the US if that's an option. And again, this might not be an option available to everyone. For example, if your work assignment has ended, then what do you do? Well, then the solution is that you probably have to file for some other status, like a visitor visa, do a change of status application to something like a visitor visa in the US. And so that will let you stay on until you are allowed to travel back to your home country. Unfortunately, at this time, there is no fee waiver for an application like this. So, every week or every couple of days, I get a question from a client saying, oh, I'm going to file for a change of status to a visitor visa. Is there can I not pay the filing fee because this is something that was outside my control? And unfortunately, the immigration agency has not announced any kind of relaxation for these filing fees. So you have to file the application as you would do in the normal course of things. What else? Okay, so another topic I wanted to touch upon is about the consular services. So most of the US consular services in abroad are suspended. They only allow for emergency requests. And the definition of emergency, that it's a pretty high standard. So you can't ask for a visa appointment because your client needs you urgently in the US. You have to show something compelling, something really strong. They also don't entertain visa requests or any kind of consular service unless it is for a US citizen. So for services to US citizens are still available at the consular points, but not for the regular visa processing. Okay. Next, I'll talk a little bit about the loans that Baljit touched upon. So the SBA loans and the payroll protection and EIDL loans. So that was a wonderful initiative from the US government. And as you heard, the package is really large. So a lot of people have benefited from it. But at the same time, there have been questions around whether this will have an adverse impact on immigration. So for example, for employees, whether benefiting from any of these loans will have future immigration impact for them. So the short question is, no, not really. So let's see, for an employer who is applying for one of these loans, will it have any impact on their ability to sponsor an H-1B application or a green card petition for an employee later on? As of now, the answer is no. Then the next question was whether these loans are available to US businesses which are owned by green card holders, or let's say somebody on a visa. And again, your eligibility for these loans is dependent on the corporation itself. So the fact that the corporation is owned by an individual who is a green card holder or not a US citizen, that doesn't really have any impact on the ability to apply for one of these loans. Next, again, with the unemployment benefits, there has been a surge in the unemployment insurance benefit filings in the last couple of months. So it was not clear at that point whether somebody in H-1B status could apply for one of these benefits, for the unemployment benefits. For a long time, I think most immigration practitioners took the position that H-1B visa holders cannot avail of these benefits, but it appears that many states are actually now paying out unemployment benefits even to H-1B visa holders, and they're not discriminating on the basis of your visa status. So that's something that people could look at individually based on the state and location, and and also depending on whether they are in H-1B status, things like that. The last point I want to talk about briefly is the stimulus benefit. So as part of the whole COVID package, there was a stimulus payment of about $1,000, a little over $1,000 paid to all all individuals in the US. There are some criteria around it. So based on whether you file tax returns and your income in the last fiscal year and things like that. So the question was whether non-immigrant workers, people in visa status, can avail of these stimulus benefits without having an adverse impact on their immigration status. Again, the answer to this is there is, it doesn't hurt in any way. You can avail of this benefit. There is the main issue when it first came out was when the package was first introduced was whether there would be a public charge concern, because when you are here in the US as a visa holder, you are not supposed to take public benefits from the state. So there was uncertainty about whether the stimulus benefit would actually count as a public charge, and it's pretty much been clarified that there's no such issue, because it's not like visa holders are going and applying for these benefits. It's a stimulus check that is given to all people who are eligible, and the government is providing it without you even applying for it. So as a result, there is no public charge concern around the stimulus benefit. So I think that's enough about various visa types and about the stimulus benefit. The last topic I want to touch upon briefly is President Trump's proclamation, which came out in the last week of April. This is the executive order where he had declared that immigration would be that all immigration would be suspended for some time because of the pandemic, and obviously it caused some consternation in the immigrant community. But when the executive order finally came out, it was found to be much narrower in its scope than was expected. So basically, it only limits the issuance of immigrant visas for a period of 60 days. And it only applies to a certain very small category of people. So at this time, it's not going to have any significant impact in the industry. And the other thing to note is that it also doesn't affect people who are already in the US. So, if at all, the impact is only going to be for people who are outside the US and would need an immigrant visa to travel into the US. So mostly this would be, siblings of US citizens who have been waiting for visas for a very long time anyway. And so it's just a matter of 60 more days. But, the concern is that this, a restriction like this, although it is only for 60 days, it might set the stage for more restrictions later on. So one of the things that the declaration or the executive order also said is that they will do an analysis of the whole non-immigrant visas, like the H-1Bs, and they will come up with a report on that within 60 days and see if any restrictions need to be imposed for these visas as well. And so it will be seen whether it will also bar any new H-1Bs or L-1 visas. Unlikely, because there is going to be a lot of pushback from the tech industry, but we will know in about 30 days. Okay.
Thanks, Dia, for the presentation. It was very insightful. So one thing which I wanted to ask you, because you are an expert in immigration, do you see that the world is going in a deglobalization scenario now, wherein US will have more restrictions in future, and the US might take this as an opportunity to bring in more restriction on immigration visa in future?
Well, if you look at the whole history of United States immigration, there can never, this is a nation of immigrants. And so the way that United States looks at immigration has historically been different from the way that other countries look at it. I actually think we have a very very liberal and very welcoming immigration policy in general. But of course, they've had to set some limits on it because of, some of the, the logic is that the resources are limited. And so you don't want unlimited, there has to be some restrictions on people coming in. So to answer your question, will there be restrictions in the future? I think some changes to the current programs, because they feel that the way the current H-1B program or the way the current green card program works is not, is not in the best interest of the country. They need to change it a little bit to meet the current, the need of the current industry. So we can expect some changes, but unlikely that there will be any major restrictions. That is my take on it.
And any thoughts on L1 visa for entrepreneurs?
Yes. So, the L1 visa and some of the other visa types right now, they do, they do provide for entrepreneurs, right? So, for example, an entrepreneur can use the L1 visa. They can use the EB5. There is the E2. There's, a few other visa options for entrepreneurs. There is no special entrepreneur visa. Entrepreneurs pretty much have to find a category that works for them and use it. There was a startup visa program that was, that they talked about a few years ago, but that, never saw the light of day. So that's one of the few things that they might actually come up because they do want to encourage entrepreneurship and more investment. There is also some expectation that with the whole, pandemic situation, they might change some of the requirements around the whole EB5 program. For those who might be aware, they had actually raised the investment limits, investment requirements for the EB5 program towards the end of last year. So, I think one of the general feelings in the community is that if you lower the investment requirement, that would actually bring in more funds and would also help, the economy at this time.
Okay. Thanks, Dia, for clearing out doubts. I will now hand over to Rahul from our India office. Rahul will talk about setting up in India and compliances around setting in India, and also some of the measures which the Indian government has announced in the light of COVID-19. So, Rahul, welcome you.
Thank you, Alok, and thank you, Baljit and Dia, for taking up the topic extensively. So we'll quickly go through the things which are required for India setup, not only for the Indian businesses, but also for people who want to come and set up in India and start their business in India, having a holding subsidiary relationship with US entities. So we'll quickly go through the basic requirements which we have. So in India, we should have at least 2 shareholders and 2 directors, and to form a private limited company, which is a C Corp equivalent to the US. And one of the directors should be a resident Indian director. Then we have the charter documents of the company, the memorandum, the articles need to have a registered office. And nowadays the registered office, there is an annual form which is filed for the registered office in India. There's no minimum share capital requirement. Earlier there used to be a share capital requirement. Now there is no specific quantum limit on the share capital, but share capital should be there, and it should be like within 180 days of incorporation should be deposited into the corporate bank account of the company. We have a mandatory requirement of appointing an auditor in a private limited company. I think, Baljit, we had this question. Maybe we can cover this together. Like, what is the audit requirement in the US? We understand there is no specific audit requirement over there. So, is there a threshold? Like in India, we appoint after incorporation of a company, we appoint a statutory auditor immediately.
Yeah, so in US, we do not have any specific audit requirements. Only audit requirement is for the public companies. There are different level of certifications that we have in the US. One is compilation, then second is review, third is audit. Audit being the highest level of checking. However, the business choose to get it done for certain reasons, like for investors, for bank funding purposes, or for consolidation purposes in India. But in general, there is no requirement for private limited companies to have their accounts audited.
No threshold limit, upper threshold also. If someone crosses certain turnover limit, they come under the audit category, nothing like that.
No. So that is something that used to be there in India, right? Like if I remember, and I'm sure it's still there, which is called a tax audit. So no, there is no such requirement here in the US.
Got it. Thanks. I think we had this question also, so I thought we'll cover with this. So in India, with a private limited company, statutory auditor appointment is mandatory, irrespective of the turnover the company is having. So, and there are some other local licenses which are also required, like trade licenses there for companies or entities who are into trade, and shops and establishment licenses are required based on different state laws, and there are labor laws which are applicable. So if there is a foreign shareholder which or a director which has to be part of an Indian entity, so usually their passport as identity proof and address proof utility bill is required, and we usually require it to be either apostilled through the apostillation authority, or it has to be certified by the Indian embassy. Or it should be notarized. Then only it's an acceptable document in India for India incorporation. And if a India subsidiary is being created from the US, like we have foreign direct investment allowed under automatic route in most of the sectors, but there are few sectors which are under the restricted categories. There are certain filings which are required to be done. So when the share subscription money comes into India, there is a filing of form FCGPR with the Reserve Bank of India, and even when the shares are transferred to a foreign shareholder, be it in US or elsewhere, there is a RBI reporting in form FCTRS which has to be done. So Indian entities or Indian person, if they are holding, if they are a shareholder in a foreign company, they need to report it in their income tax return. And the companies which have foreign shareholders, they need to file foreign asset and liability return, the FLA return, by 15th of July every year.
So just one point here, the Indian government has amended the FDI norm some time back, wherein they have clearly stated that all the countries which share land borders with India cannot directly invest in Indian companies or invest in India. So they need to have a approval route via the central government.
Yes.
So there was one specific country, they're trying to block one specific country for that, because other than that country, the other countries anyway don't invest much in India. So just wanted to add to that point.
Okay. And so we have a requirement of annual performance report, which has to be filed by companies who are in the foreign holding subsidiary structure in India. So there are a few specific requirements which becomes applicable when there are a foreign shareholding or a holding subsidiary relationship existent.
So Rahul, I have one question. For our taxpayers, in the US, there are many people who are attending from the US, and I thought it will be relevant. So, what happens is with our clients, they ask for, sometimes they will ask for certain audited financials, to be filed in India for the US company that, they have interest in. Now, is that required? Because not all of our clients ask. Sometimes we hear it, sometimes we don't hear it. So what exactly is the law there?
So I think one reason could be banks here, because most of the banks in India, if it is an entity, be it a private limited company or an LLP, so the banks, they rely upon the audited financials. So maybe people who have banking exposure, they have taken loans, they at times would be required to submit their consolidated financials or their group financials to the banks. And banks here in India, because audits are mandatory for each and every company, they understand only the audited financials, or at least financials signed by a chartered accountant or the CA's counterpart, be it CPA in US or CA's in other countries. I think
Just
banking.
yeah. And just to add, see, if there is a subsidiary mother relationship wherein the Indian entity is either a holding company or a subsidiary, most cases holding company wherein the accounts are getting consolidated in India, the Indian accounts will be getting audited by a chartered accountant. Now, more than many times the CA firms would also ask the client that, because they don't want to uh, form an opinion on accounts which are there in US, to get these books of accounts audited and then we consolidate in Indian books. But there is no requirement under the law. The Indian auditors which are being appointed for the auditor of the consolidated financials can straight away go and form an opinion. So there is no requirement as such, but larger companies or companies wherein the auditors or the client would want, they would ask for it.
Okay, thanks.
So yeah, so moving forward, there's a lot of discussion around round tripping and step down subsidiary. I don't think we'll be able to discuss that in much detail, but normally Indian entities, so wherein Indian subsidiaries are incorporated outside India, so those entities are not allowed to again create a step down subsidiary back in India. And money flow, like Indian people investing in foreign entities, and then the money coming back to India as a foreign direct investment back in India, is something which is restricted by the Reserve Bank of India. And so this particular planning is very important when we create a holding sub relationship with foreign countries, be it US or otherwise. Other important thing which we need to keep in mind and plan is transfer pricing. As Baljeet mentioned, the transfer pricing laws are very similar in India and US, wherein whenever there is a transaction between two associated enterprise, the transaction should be at arm's length price and at a reasonable margin, so that the respective government, they do not lose their tax revenues. And here there is a transfer pricing audit which is mandatory. Whenever there is a transaction between two associated enterprise, there is a filing in Form 3CEB which has to be done mandatorily by the company. And upon crossing of certain threshold limit, they have to maintain a transfer pricing audit, transfer pricing study report, and transfer pricing documentation. Apart from that, whenever Indians are forming entities outside India, be it subsidiary, be it Indian individuals, resident individuals incorporating entities outside India, the income tax laws have this concept of place of effective management, wherein the effective management of the companies incorporated outside India is seen. If the company is just incorporated outside India, and all its transactions, all its business, all its decision making, all its ownership, everything still remains in India, there are certain things which has to be kept in mind. Otherwise, they kind of become a restricted transaction. Even though for applicability of POEM rules, there is a threshold limit of annual turnover of 50 crores. So smaller companies, they don't need to worry about it. But companies whose turnover cross the limit, they need to structure their entities in such a way that they do not fall under the category and get restricted under the POEM laws. There are general anti-avoidance rules available in the income tax laws, which has to be taken care of, so that there is no genuine profit moving out of India, or kind of tax avoiding tools being used in the structures. So all these things have to be kept in mind when holding subsidiary relationship or entities are incorporated outside India. Apart from that, so we had a question around tax deducted at source and withholding taxes. So any payment which happens from India to outside India, be it between the holding subsidiary entities or otherwise, if it is in the nature of service revenue or service expense, like for India it would be an expense, and for the US entity, if it's revenue under the intercompany service agreement or the master service agreement, all such payments have to undergo the check if TDS is applicable on such payments, and there are rules prescribed under the income tax laws wherein there are form 15 CA and CB which are prescribed. Those forms have to be complied with. So if there's a holding company which provides certain services to its sub in India, the payment will have to undergo the test and filing of form 15 CA-CB before the payment goes through. One more important aspect is, like for instance, there's an Indian subsidiary and there is a US holding company, and there is a transaction which happens wherein someone buys out the US holding company. So, for instance, there was a company earlier or group of persons who were holding the US holding company earlier. They sell out their stake in the US holding to some other stakeholder, maybe in US or maybe elsewhere in the world. Someone will think that the transaction is happening between two foreigners, and the shares transacted are also the US shares. But if it has an Indian subsidiary and the underlying asset is in India, the Indian tax laws and the Indian government has the right to tax such transaction, and capital gains on such transactions are taxable in India. And even there is a provision of withholding taxes wherein two foreign parties making payment of the consideration will have to deduct tax and then make the payment. And the taxes have to be paid to the Indian government for the underlying Indian assets or the underlying Indian shares.
So one of the things which we always suggest to our clients is that many people just travel to US and they swipe their credit card and they set up a company in US. Now, from a Indian perspective, the RBI perspective, there are a lot of filings which are required. One of the filing is that whenever you incorporate a company outside India, you have to do a RBI filing in India. So you have to be very, very careful. If you don't do, there are stringent penalties. So yeah, setting up is easy, and from US tax laws, that might not be very critical at that point of time, but from Indian tax laws, it's very critical that you set up from a valid source and a valid route.
Yeah, and after doing all the compliances and keeping the structure in place.
Yeah.
So with this, we'll also take up one question which was there, wherein it was asked that if we are an Indian company and there is withholding which is happening from the US, how do we take the credit of those taxes? So Indian tax laws allows the credit. So there are double taxation avoidance agreement which is available. India US does have a comprehensive double taxation avoidance agreement, and even if with the countries with whom India does not have the DTAA, the Income Tax Act provides that if there is a withholding tax and tax has been paid on certain income in some other territory, and we have proof of payment of such taxes, the credit of such taxes can be claimed by paying income tax in India. So there will be no double taxation. While filing the income tax return, there is a option of claiming the credit of the taxes which has been withheld by the US customer or any other customer.
Rahul, I just want to add here, for listeners. So see, what happens is that, by default, withholding in the US is 30%. Now, effective tax rate, here is 21%, and I'm sure in India also it is less. So, even if they try to take the benefit of the withholding, I think it's always a good idea that the companies should avoid the withholding, and by doing that W-8 Ben form, if the services are not being rendered in the United States.
Sure. There are certain companies who have people deputed in companies in United States, or they go there and provide the services. In those cases, I think withholding will come into play, and so those companies, they mostly have this query that how do they take the credit, or how do they use the taxes which have been already withheld. So moving forward on the measures which have been taken by the Indian government under the COVID-19 crisis. So the Indian government as of now has not come out with any specific loan for the companies, apart from a SIDBI loan which we'll be talking in the latest slides, but they have provided certain relaxations. So most of the due dates, statutory due dates, which were falling during the period of lockdown announcement till 30th of June, have been extended till 30th of June under various statutory laws, be it GST, be it income tax, be it other labor laws. Also, there are extensions which have come up through various different notifications. Each and every statutory due date, we'll have to see the specific date which it has been extended to, but in most cases extensions have come till 30th of June. Delayed payment in TDS, the interest has been reduced to 9%. Even in delayed payment of GST for people whose turnover, for persons whose turnover are more than 5 crore, the interest rate has been reduced to 9%. So there was a Vivad Se Vishwas scheme to close down the litigations which are pending in the income tax laws at various authorities, and 31st March was the due date for cutoff date for the scheme. The same has been extended till 30th of June now. Apart from it, various due dates for issue of notices, approval orders, filing of reports, applications. Even for income tax return for financial year 19-20, the due date for making investments and in insurance schemes and in ETC related deductions, making donations, all those have been extended till 30th of June as of now. The government has processed all the IT refunds which have been due, and we are seeing that they are now processing the income tax returns also, which are due to be processed for financial year 19-20, and they are fast tracking the refund process so that the companies whose refund are stuck with the GST department and with the income tax department, they get their due refunds quickly, and they are able to use those funds in the time of this crisis. So yeah, under the GST laws, late filing fee and interest has been waived off till 30th of June. Composition scheme, opting the composition scheme has also been extended till 30th of June. Custom clearance are operating 24/7, and I think we discussed this. GST and income tax refunds are being processed, and even custom refunds are processed on a fast track mode. There are certain relaxations under the Registrar of Companies and Ministry of Corporate Affairs, also corporate law related relaxations. These are mostly relaxation of additional fee till so MCA registry moratorium has been issued till 30th of September. There are late filing fees on all the forms which has been relaxed. The board meetings related relaxation have been provided, wherein 60 days relaxation has been provided for holding board meetings, plus the shareholders meeting and board meetings can now be held through video conferences. Earlier, the company's auditor's report order CARO 2020 was becoming applicable for the financial year 1920. Now that has been extended by 1 year. And for independent directors also, there are relaxations that even if they are not able to hold the meeting, it shall not be counted as a violation. There are other procedural due dates which has been extended. So for newly incorporated companies, there are Form 20A which has to be filed. So relaxation of 6 months has been provided for that. One important relaxation is threshold for bankruptcy. So earlier, if there was a default of even 1 lakh rupee default of creditors, the bankruptcy and insolvency code could have been invoked. Now the threshold has been increased to 1 crore rupee. And all expenditure under the COVID-19 related measures are being covered under the CSR expenditure under the CSR norms for the companies where the corporate social responsibility related norms are applicable. Apart from that, there are various relaxations under the labor laws. So the government is paying the complete 24% of the PF in certain cases. Like earlier, it was half paid by the employer and half deducted by the employee. Now the government would be taking care of that contribution, but it's applicable wherein for the people who are earning less than 15,000 and for small companies who have less than 100 workers on their on their payroll, and this benefit is available for 3 months. Apart from that, the government has relaxed PF related regulations to allow people to withdraw money as an advance, 70% of the corpus or 3 months of the wages, whichever is lower from the PF account for their contingency requirements during the COVID-19 situation. Under the ESI laws, the filing due dates have been extended by a month. Apart from that, to take care of the liquidity crisis, there is a Small Industries Development Bank of India (SIDBI), which has launched a scheme to help the companies take SIDBI loan, and so there are various actions which has been taken by the RBI, wherein they have reduced the repo rate by 75 basis point, and they have provided 3 months of moratorium on the payment of EMI on term loans and even credit card bills. Plus, the government has and the RBI has infused money into the SIDBI and other government-run organizations like NABARD to take care of MSME loans and farmer loans and bring in more liquidity into the banking system. So that was a summary about the
Thanks.
steps which the Indian government has taken. Second round of package is awaited, and there is a lot of news and discussions going on around the government of India coming up with a second financial package to help MSMEs, and as of now we are awaiting the announcement from the government.
Thanks, Rahul, for a very detailed presentation. So what has happened in India is that they have first tried to cover the unbanked people and people who are dependent on their daily wage. And in terms of real help to MSME and SME, in terms of liquidity, loans, which has not happened yet on the ground in India, and we're still awaiting a lot of declarations from India to understand and to suggest what's best, but they have not been able to do yet. We will see. The government has only extended the due dates and have created some of the policies, but in terms of real liquidity, they have not helped yet. So we have to see. Now we will start with the Q&A session, and I have got one question for Baljit, I think. This is from Santoshi Chandak. Santoshi, I can, or I can just ask you on your behalf. So he says that in case of a company incorporated in US and providing services to Indian company asking for PAN for deduction of tax. So if I'm not wrong, US company can claim the exemption from TDS to be deducted. What are the forms US company need to submit to claim the exemption from TDS? Have you understood the question?
So Baljit, if the Indian company deducts deducts tax in India, so what kind of forms the US IRS would be requiring to give the exemption? Is there any specific requirement? Usually, PAN is what the companies they ask for before making the deduction.
No, so is it the US company doing the withholding or the Indian company with doing the withholding?
Indian company is withholding for the US company. So what does the US company need in order to claim that
Right.
credit in the US?
In the US, see, there is no specific form needed, from the Indian company. So what happens is, on the tax return when we file for individual taxpayer, we have form 1116, which is a foreign tax credit form, and for the businesses we have 1118 form that is filed. And while filing the tax return, we rely on the information that is provided by the taxpayer. We don't have to submit any documentation with the tax return. All the filings are here electronic. It's only, if the tax authority raises it later, that is a time when we might have to produce this documentation. Also, one other aspect is, in India, any withholding which are done are on a fiscal year basis from April 1 to March 31st. However, in US, all the filings that we do, on a calendar year basis. So usually, on a payment basis, we are able to claim all the credits that we want to claim. Just that, we should be keeping all these withholding documents that, we have in India.
Okay. That's great. Devendra is asking for how much someone should expect to spend on annual accounting and compliance and taxes if there is not much of revenue. I think, Devendra, we will send you the details over the email. I think it's better to answer that offline because we need to understand few of the specific things. Then Dharmendra, my friend, is asking what is the best way to set up a company structure in US as HQ and having an Indian company as subsidiary. So he already has a company in India, I think. So Baljit, this is to you.
Okay, yeah, sure. See, when we set up a company in US, first of all, we need to see that where we want to have the control. Do we want to leave the control to US or we want to leave the control to India? Now, when we talk about setting up, we recently discussed at the beginning of this webinar that when we are setting up, when you are having a US company as a head office and then Indian subsidiary is there, and then or you have other way around, you have Indian company as a parent company and US company as a subsidiary. From a US tax standpoint, it's not going to make much difference. You are eventually paying the tax rate at a 21% at a federal level and then state whatever it applies. Now the difference it makes is that when the US company is a parent company and Indian company is a subsidiary company, then there is an additional filing. It's a detailed form on the financial statement of the Indian company that is filed when we file the taxes and report all the income of the Indian company. So it's not consolidated for tax purposes. It's primarily an information return. Towards the end of last year, there was all these provisions, new regulations that Trump introduced to basically make sure that all the companies who have been parking their huge funds in overseas countries, they pay their share of taxes. Going forward, on all the retained earning for the prior retained earning. Now going forward, all the companies who are head office in the US and then subsidiary in a foreign country, they need to report all this income. However, if in their own country the tax rate is higher than the US, in US currently it's 21%, then they will not be taxed on the income as such. However, if they are based out of a country where the tax rate is lower in the US, lower than the US, then they will end up paying. So the idea is the US want to discourage all the companies who are parking funds outside. So they have given a reduced rate of 21%. And at the same time, they want to make sure that companies still don't find the locations where they have less rate than 21%. So they kind of penalizing those companies to park the funds there.
Okay, that's great. Baljit, one more query which I have, which my friend is asking is that in US the corporate tax rate is 20%, 21%.
21% currently.
So is there a slab or it's a fixed rate? For example, in Singapore you have different slabs.
Right. No, it's a fixed rate. So earlier there used to be brackets. They used to start, all from like 5%, 10%, and then all the way up to 39%. But then with this recent reforms, the rate has been changed to 21% fixed rate.
And is there a tax exemption to a startup for first few years of operation, something like that?
No, not really. There's no exemption.
Okay. So just to summarize, because most of the people want to set up in Delaware, you rightly put down the points why someone want to set up in Delaware. But is there any specific reason why someone should not set up in Delaware? I mean, let me ask you from a different point of view.
Yeah, of course. See, like I said, we talked about different benefits. So Delaware is kind of a branding. More than 50% of the public company in the United States are based out of Delaware. And the reason is that we discuss about friendly laws and then being preferred by the investors. In the earlier years. So for the companies who are really going to have some base office and then going to expand all over the US, Delaware makes sense. But then talk about the company. Due to the nature of the business or otherwise, if they want to be confined to one state only, it really doesn't help them, to incorporate in Delaware. Like let's say, there is a company in New Jersey, and they know that the nature of their business is they are going to have a physical location in this state only, and they are not going to look for investor. It's a family-owned business. Now, how the Delaware will add value to them? All they will do is, they will comply with Delaware also, and then they will need to comply with New Jersey also. So for those people, it will not make sense. In general, if you want to have this Delaware branding, or you are uncertain, as to where you want to go in the US when you are entering here, then Delaware is a good choice. And then all the other reasons that we discussed earlier.
Okay. And also in terms of funding, so Delaware attracts the maximum funding for startups, tech startups.
Exactly. So it's not the Delaware itself, it's that the investors. So basically investor, because of all these reasons that we discussed, the advantage that Delaware has, then what happens is, like when the investors are looking to invest in a company, they would like to have a formal structure like a C corporation, and they would like to have that a company which is based out of Delaware. Like main office is Delaware. But then obviously, when we are talking about investment, those are the companies, who are thinking of making it big. They are thinking of expanding it all over. And then, they are going to have all these investors, different kind of investor, different type of stocks. For example, in the C corporation, we can have different classes of stock versus, comparing it to a S corporation. You can have only one class of stock. Now, when you are talking about all these investments and all that, now they are going to have all these, they're going to prefer all these features, like, you can have a preference share, and, you have a Delaware branding, and then you have a flexibility, you have flexible laws, you have a flexibility to expand anywhere. So that's where I think Delaware is preferred.
Perfect. So as we wait for more queries, Baljit, if you can.
We have one question from Amal. So he's asking, is it possible to get a debit or a credit card for a US company incorporated by non-residents from India?
See, it is difficult. Obviously, all these credit cards are issued, based on the credit history. And then, to build a credit history, you need to have a social security number. So, it might be possible, if people go to the bank and then kind of trying to figure out, but then initially, they might be able to get a secured card where, they make a deposit of a certain funds and they get the credit card for the same amount. Now, you will wonder that why then what's the point of having a credit card when they need to deposit the fund? The point is that initially bank has a security, and then once they build the history, they kind of start doing transactions and then keep paying the credit card on a timely basis, then they're able to build that history. However, having said that, it really depends on the credit history. Most of the business, how they figure out is, they have some officer in place who have a social security number, and then from their social security, they are able to get the credit card, secured credit card, and eventually once they build the history, then they are able to have a credit card with no extra deposits.
Got it, Baljit. But Baljit, couple of more questions from Amal. So like one is asking is, in India, like we pay quarterly taxes, advanced taxes. So if there is a profit which is there, do we need to pay any quarterly taxes, any advanced taxes, or is it determined at the year end itself and then the taxes are paid for the profits in the US company?
Yeah. So see, as I mentioned during the presentation that in US the rule is that you pay the taxes as you earn the income. So requirement is on a quarterly basis, very similar to advanced taxes in India. However, if there is a delay in the payment of the taxes, then the interest rate of late payment is not that high, provided businesses pay by the due date. And some of the businesses deliberately also choose not to pay because it's a good financing at a very reasonable rate, 3 to 4%, and then they pay at the time of filing the tax returns.
Okay.
Got
Okay.
it. Got it.
One
And
more.
so
Yeah, Rahul. Please carry on.
So one last question. What we understand is that the taxes, state-wise taxes, is paid based on the nexus which is created with different states, and nexus is determined on a case-to-case basis and also on a state-to-state basis depending upon the different state laws. So there are many companies, mainly tech-based companies, who do their sales through apps. So be it Google Play or Apple iOS. So when the sales are happening through those apps, so if someone is creating an app and someone is downloading it and paying it, how do we determine the state-wise nexus and how do we determine the liability state-wise?
Yeah, so see, like I said, there are two ways a business can have nexus. Either it's a physical nexus or it's an economic nexus. Now, physical nexus is when businesses have some sort of a physical presence, like they have employees or they have some sort of a property. They are renting out a property there, or they have a customer in the state and they're generating revenue out of them. So that's a physical nexus. Now, economic nexus is even if there is no physical presence, but they're deriving some sort of economic benefit, and that is generally the case when there are customer which are based out of that state. Now, having said that, each state will have their rules. Like I had also said that there is a threshold requirements. For example, there will be like either you are having $50,000 of payroll in the state or having $500,000 of revenue in the state, then only you establish the nexus. So when we say that how do we see that whether the revenue belongs to that state or no? So there are sourcing rules. Some state will say that if your customer is based out of the state, then and any revenue that you're earning, that belongs to that state. And other state will say that if you are you are physically present in one state and any revenue that you generate out of the state while sitting in this state, doesn't matter where your customer is, then that revenue belongs to that state. So that's how they do the sourcing of the revenue. If you will carefully analyze this, there could always be a conflict situation. For example, if I talk about New Jersey, New Jersey says, let's say that the sourcing is going to be done on a physical presence basis. Any revenue that you generate out of New Jersey belongs to New Jersey. At the same time, California says that if you are deriving any economic benefit out of California, then the revenue belongs to the state of California. Now, imagine a situation that sitting in New Jersey, you have customers in California. Now it's a conflict situation, where you allocate the revenue. So that's where we actually have to go into the depth of it and see that how exactly it will work. Now, since we are talking about this sourcing of revenue, one very important point for all the viewers here. So what happens is that many businesses they think of having their head office in various states, and then there is always a situation that they have a choices to make. For example, should they have their head office in the state of California, or they should have a head office in the state of Texas. Now, so if I have a choice to make, I will tell them that you go for Texas. Why? Because in California, what happens is once you have a head office, there are certain city taxes. So if you have a head office based out of a specific city in California, then not only you pay the state income taxes, you are also subjected to city taxes. Now, and another point is that in the state of California, let's say that you use all this sourcing rule and you do not allocate revenue to any other state. Now, California has a throwback rule. What it means is that if your revenue does not belong to any other state, going by the sourcing rule, then you put it in California and pay the state taxes in California. And New Jersey doesn't have a throwback rule. So, because all the states have their different sourcing rule, there could be a situation that there is an amount of revenue that technically doesn't belong to any state, and businesses are able to save state income taxes.
Wow, that's very insightful.
Okay.
So Baljit, with that, I would request you to, if you just summarize in terms of what Chugg firm does in US and what are the services which we can take it in US from your firm?
Yeah, see, but, like I'm sure that like many of the viewers already know, and then so we are a full service CPA and law firm. Technically, we are two separate legal entities: Chugg CPAs LLP and then Chugg LLP. So in the CPA firm, we practice pretty much everything that is public accounting firm would do. Simple bookkeeping and payroll compliances, sales tax filings, income tax filing, and complex income tax, like when the businesses are operating in various states, 401k audits, financial statement audits, any due diligences. Similarly, on the corporate side, the legal side of it, we have, immigration, we have litigation, M&A services, we have corporate work, and pretty much, anything that a full service law firm will do. So we are present, in the US, in 7 states, and then we have like affiliates all over.
Yeah. Thanks, Baljit. And just to clarify, so we have a relationship with Chugg LLP, wherein we have so we are a partner firm. So Tax Mantra and Chugg are both partner firms, wherein for all the work which we have, we get it done from their firm in US, and it's been a great relationship. A brief overview of Tax Mantra. So Tax Mantra, we have our presence in India and in Singapore and in US via Chugg firm, and in India we have our offices in Kolkata, Bangalore, Mumbai, and in Singapore we through our partners there we have direct presence in Singapore. And we are also a full-fledged tax and legal firm, wherein most of our work is through the we are active in startup ecosystem and MSME and growing companies. So that's what we do. And for any requirement which you have in India or in US or in Singapore, you can get in touch with us. We will send a thanks email to all the attendees who have joined in today with our contact details, so that if you have any need which you require in any of these 3 countries, we can help you to get it solved. So thanks, Baljit, for joining in. It's been 2 hours. You have joined us in the morning, early in the morning. So thanks. I think and stay safe. I know you are traveling to office these days, but stay safe. Take care. Thanks, Rahul, for this, and Dia, thank you for the immigration information which you provided. You will have many queries under the immigration, because most of our clients would want to go for L1 and other things once the COVID situation improves a little bit, and we will start the travel again. So thanks, everyone.
Right, of course. Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Baljit. Thanks, Rahul. Thanks, Dia. Once again, stay safe. Take care. We will touch base soon.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you to all the listeners.
Yeah, thanks to all the
everyone.
listeners. Yeah.